Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching. That doesn't happen, Paul. Are you going to a wedding? Came out somewhere over the shoulder of a dark-haired man in a white robe turned sharply around. He did not see that there was anyone else in the residence room. It turned out that the head of the department himself had looked in. He was worried that someone invited to the wedding of the new mayor of the city may not come. "Sure, I'll be there," the doctor responded. Paul had worked at the city's main hospital for 15 years. He was a dentist. Those patients who were afraid of the dentist's office were willing to endure pain, but he knew his job well and tried to make sure that people weren't afraid of his office. He was vying with private clinics, promising huge salaries. But Paul didn't like to stand out, didn't like the fame he would surely have to face. "Hurry up, Gorge doesn't like to be late. He's a very serious man." "You know how important it is to show your best," the superintendent reminded him and walked out. And Gorge was the new face of the city. He was sent here to restore order straight from the capital. There he was known for his anti-corruption activities, renowned for his intransigence and incorruptibility. Gorge was a middle-aged man about to marry for the third time. The nurses said he was a hard man, extremely jealous and picky. These qualities helped him to advance in his career, but they also prevented him from building a family life. Ambition and arrogance, all that Paul had time to discern in him during his stay in the clinic. The mayor was a newcomer to the city and came to meet the doctors, to find out personally what and how he appeared in the clinic. At 8:00, he put on shoe covers and personally approached each specialist, listened to complaints and made notes in a notebook. That's how their meeting took place. And later, the new mayor personally asked the superintendent to bring the staff to his wedding. Cults, employees, and city hall staff were also invited. He wanted to throw a lavish celebration and show everyone that he was the master of life here. The junior staff did not accept the invitation. Touched, Gorge wanted to see people at the party who could be of use to him later. A very striking gesture that could be interpreted ambiguously. But the new mayor didn't care much. Some people were already calling him the new speaker behind his back. Paul finished his work with his last patient, who was a child. In his 40s, he had no children of his own. It didn't work out. He remembered family life like a bad dream. It turned out like everyone else's. Loved one, married another. He lived in the marriage for 5 years and divorced. Now he was an enviable bachelor, a sought-after professional. He didn't even think about having a family. But he always wanted to have children. A couple of years ago, Paul even thought about adoption, but the idea never came to fruition. He got into his car and stopped at a mall on his way home. It was already getting dark outside the windows. October added to the length of the day, a scattering of yellow leaves everywhere. What to buy the mayor as a gift? I still did not understand why he invited a whole staff of strangers to such a rather personal celebration. Is the wedding for him just an excuse to show off in all its glory? We can't understand them, Paul thought, and chose a picture. It had the forest, the mountains, the river, and the frame was beautiful. Involuntarily, he thought that in his bachelor lair just such beauty was missing. He had no need for money, so he decided he would buy one for sure. Put on a shirt, pants, and tie. Cleaned his boots, took the picture with him and got into his comfortable, spacious foreign car. The drive promised to be long. Apparently the mayor had decided to settle here for a long time and had bought a large country house. That's where the party was taking place. An hour later, Paul met his colleagues at the gate and went with them to the celebration. The wedding, of course, had taken place in the afternoon. And now, in the center of the table sat an imposing, nervous, well-fed man and his beautiful wife in a wedding dress. The bustle seized him. Paul left his gift where everyone else did. The mayor nodded to him and squeezed out a smile. Immediately he switched to other, more significant guests. "I see why we're here," the therapist whispered in his ear. "We're here for the crowd, plus we owe him. Like we're not strangers. Some of the police were here for his wedding." "Judge, there were about 200 people here, judging by the tables." Paul nodded in agreement with his colleague. Only a lonely man with an incredibly inflated ego would dare to make a presentation of his luxurious life out of his wedding. Such a mayor is unlikely to earn the trust of the common people. He should have been more modest. Paul was sitting at one of the tables. Suddenly the bride Annabelle passed by, chatting with her maid of honor. "Many," Paul called out to her. The girl didn't turn around. He couldn't believe it. That he would meet her here. He could not believe that she was alive, and that she was the mayor's wife. Many called her name. Paul ran up to her and looked into her eyes. She was only slightly older and 100 times more beautiful than when he had known her. Minnie was still a student. She had big bangs and brown hair. She wore simple sweaters and didn't paint her nails. An ordinary girl. A medical student. Paul was a sophomore and she was a freshman. He didn't understand why he was attracted to her. As a young man, Paul was considered handsome and had many girls chasing him, but she fell into his heart. He approached her and asked her out, and many said yes. Thus began their romance. They kissed everywhere, in the classrooms of the university, under the stairs, on the roofs of high-rises in the park. They couldn't get enough of each other. This was the first time a guy had ever experienced such intense feelings. He was ready to die for her, and she for him. It was a great mutual love. Paul, Minnie's parents didn't like her very much. She was the daughter of a nurse, and in their family, everyone was proud of their academic successes. Both her father and mother were high achievers, the only son. His parents loved him dearly. When he brought home Minnie, she was well received and always treated kindly. But as soon as the door was slammed behind the girl, her mother doomedly asked if she wanted to look at her friend's daughter. That one was studying abroad. The relationship with Minnie lasted until Paul went to boarding school. Then they decided to live together, but they didn't move in together. They quarreled and fought, usually over nothing. Paul couldn't remember what they had fought about. But he decided that Minnie would cool down and come crawling back on her own, and she apparently thought the same thing. In the end, they just broke up. Soon Paul saw Minnie with someone else. They were walking hand in hand in the park. That day, he texted his old acquaintance Mary and asked her out. So he started dating someone else. It wasn't until a month later that he found out from mutual acquaintances that the guy was Minnie's cousin. He wanted to go back to her, but she sent him away saying it was too late. She couldn't forgive him for his relationship with Mary. It was a heated argument, and they parted that night for good. He never saw Minnie again. Paul married Mary a few months later. He wanted to numb the pain of his breakup with Minnie. But the marriage turned out to be a living hell because Mary was different, alien, cold. Temperament, lawyer, divorce specialist. She was always calm and judicious. Paul already lacked the fire, the passion of feelings. Parents, however, Maru idolized and waited for grandchildren, but the girl did not want to interrupt her career. The work was the meaning of her life, and Paul felt superfluous. He decided to divorce 5 years after the wedding. Mary merely shrugged her shoulders, packed her things, and left. Paul heard that his ex had died. He'd heard that when he and Mary had only been married for the first year. He didn't know the details. All he heard was that she was gone. He recalls the day he was told the news. Paul still shuddered. It was hard for him. After all, he knew his mother and often visited them at home. But he didn't go to the funeral. He couldn't bring himself to do it. His wife helped him distract himself. They went into the woods with tents and spent several days there. In time, Paul came to terms with the fact that she was gone and that the story was forever in the past, left in the archives of his mind. Seeing her here at the wedding, he just couldn't believe it. He needed to understand what had happened to her and why everyone was saying at the time that she was dead. Many, wait a minute, he shouted, catching up with the stranger's bride. She turned around and looked at Paul questioningly. There was no hint in her face that she had ever known him. Do you want something? She smiled politely. Paul looked into her eyes. It's me. Minnie, what are you doing? You couldn't just forget me. Or did something happen to you? You don't remember anything. Paul searched frantically for answers to the questions that came up in packs. I'm sorry, you have the wrong name. My name is Sarah, the girl said. She turned to her girlfriend again. Paul couldn't believe it. He walked back to the table. He took a drink. And he really confessed. No, it couldn't be. It was definitely her. He would have recognized her from 1000. Paul rose from his seat and went to his fiancée. Again. This time she was alone at her table. Listen, I understand. You're married now, but I just wanted to know how it turned out. I mean, everyone here said you were dead. What? The girl freaked out. What are you talking about? Her fiancé came to her screaming. What's going on? He asked. I know your fiancé. I'm sorry, I just wanted to talk to her. Minnie, tell me that you know me. You and I have met for years. The girl shook her head and hid behind her husband. The mayor's nostrils flared with rage. Man, you look like you've been drinking heavily. Go have fun. Leave my wife alone. Paul was beginning to lose his temper too. She's not Minnie, she's Sarah. You confessed, calm down, or I'll call the guards. The mayor gave out. Her birthday is July 8. She loves cats, got straight, as in medical school, and she's got a big mole right here, Paul said. And to the astonishment of the assembled crowd, he took hold of the hem of the bride's dress and pushed it aside, showing everyone the birthmark. His heart was racing in his chest. He wanted so much to believe that Minnie was alive. How does he know your birthday and birthmarks? The mayor frowned. Yeah, I have no idea. But I never went to medical school. I have an economics degree, and I'm not Minnie, answered the bride. The guests began to gather around. We had to stop this circus. Security, the mayor shouted. Paul was dragged out into the street and pushed onto the pavement. The painting flew off after him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the hospital administrator shaking his head. Tomorrow he was going to have a difficult conversation. But it wasn't that important anymore. He saw her and hope settled in his heart. Why had she denied everything? Could she not recognize him? Paul hadn't changed much in all those years. Well, not to the point of being unrecognizable anyway. All these thoughts kept him awake. On the way home, the sleepy autumn city was soothing. Pale thought the mayor might have spoken to him calmly. And he himself was abrupt, puzzling over the reasons Paul parked his car, went up to his apartment and made a strong tea. The mornings are wiser, he said to his huge cat, and went to bed with him. A year ago he was given a kitten, and now it has become his favorite living creature. He used to always say that cats weren't his thing, but it broke that stereotype of his. Now Paul couldn't remember living without a huge furry beast with a vicious appetite and a tendency to peck his chair. The next day began as expected in the superintendent's office. What's the meaning of this? He asked instead of hello. It's a long story and very personal. I have not figured it out myself. The dentist did not want to talk about it. In front of the office there was a line of suffering people. He wanted to go and relieve his patients of their pain as soon as possible. It was better to pull teeth than to reveal one's soul to one's boss, especially in a place where she would be a wife. After he left, the mayor had a long talk with his wife. Do you really know her? It sounds like you had a fight with him yesterday." The bride smiled at people for a while longer to avert her eyes and left, citing fatigue. The mayor certainly didn't want his wedding to be remembered as a scandal. "You have no idea what kind of man he is, do you? He's a very powerful man. They say he was exiled to the States because they were afraid he would rise too high in New York. That's a long way to the top. He's so temperamental. He'll be Armageddon in no time. He's a very tough man. He beat his first wife, his second wife. He's a very jealous man. He just set his fiancée up yesterday." Paul raised his eyebrows. "He doesn't know much about her, and I'm really sure I know this woman. She's important, she was to me." The superintendent cast a long glance at Paul and removed his glasses from his nose. "It was silly to scandalize anyway. You set me up too. I'm sorry. It was spontaneous. The mayor overreacted. So did his fiancée. They didn't even get into it. They talked all the way to the beginning of the day." Paul almost ran to his office. Patients were always nervous when the doctor was late. Fortunately today they were. Delayed. Fortunately there weren't many of them today. Paul spent the day as usual. At lunchtime he started searching online how to find the mayor's bride. Who was she and where was she from? The information was plentiful. Showing up at their doorstep would be foolish, so he looked for an opportunity to meet her outside the house. He managed to find out that she worked at a local business center in a management position. Paul quickly found her phone number and called. "Sarah will see you this afternoon. She just had a 5:00 p.m. opening. Would that be convenient for you?" she asked the secretary. "Certainly, thank you." Paul hung up and sighed. He couldn't wait for her to see him. It was easier to ask her to leave work for half an hour than to wait outside the building for her. The day seemed endless. Her face kept popping up in front of his eyes. Could it have been a mistake? But why Sarah? And not many. How could she have changed so much? These questions haunted him. Paul was working non-stop that day so he could see all his patients early. Fortunately, people with toothaches are not in the habit of being late. It was still light outside the windows at 5:00 p.m. It was gray. He parked his car, fixed his hair, and looked at himself in the mirror. "I'll probably get kicked out, but I have proof." On the way to the business center, he stopped by his house and grabbed his vintage photo album. In it were pictures of him with her. What would she say to that? I wonder. After getting past the security post and the secretary's defenses, he found himself in her office. Inside were bright walls, portraits of some kind of bridges. Behind the desk sat a frail girl with blonde hair, a high ponytail. She was wearing a strict dark suit. Her fingernails were also dark blue. "Good afternoon. I'm listening to you," she said, and looked up. Paul lowered himself into a chair and handed her some pictures. "Before you send me away, take a look. I don't know how you can deny it." The girl was confused and took a look. Her eyebrows went up in the picture. She took off her glasses, then put them back on. "My God, it's me, but it's not me," she declared. "I just want to understand, how is that possible?" In the pictures of many, she was a medical student. We dated for a few years, then broke up very stupidly. I was told she was dead. I accepted it and lived a normal life until I saw you. Do you understand? The girl was already listening intently to Paul, now and then glancing at the pictures. "I thought you were crazy, or you wanted something from me. You know, you shouldn't have come near me in front of Gorge anyway. He's very impulsive. I hear he hits women." "Why did you marry him in the first place?" came up the dentist. The girl in the chair shrugged. "He didn't hit me. You know, there's a lot of good in him. Everyone has mistakes from the past. But it doesn't matter, I guess. I mean, you know." "It wasn't me?" she asked. Paul folded his arms across his chest and shook his head. "I guessed yesterday about the mole and your birthday, didn't I? You did. That information is freely available. God, you still think I'm crazy for coming after you, don't you? Look at the pictures. They're worn out because I've been going over them a lot. I loved that woman. He was starting to lose his temper. She was wildly lucky to have you. She also got angry right away and wanted to kick him out the door already. Paul smiled. You're even angry, just like her. She was very impulsive. Hurry. The girl stood up and walked over to the closet. She threw some documents in front of the visitor's face. Look here. This is my diploma. I graduated in economics in the States. I did an internship there. I've never lived in this city. I just recently came here with my fiancée. My name is Sarah. You got it right for your birthday. You were right about the birthmark, too. Paul looked at her and realized what could be the problem. There was only one thing to do, she asked tiredly. If I knew a woman who looked exactly like you and your birthday was on the same day, then you had a twin sister. The birthmark confirms that theory, too. Sarah shook her head. I'm not a foster child. I have a mom and a dad. My mom works for the city government. My dad's a translator. But there are no other options anyway. Sarah grinned. I'm sorry, I have to work. You surprised me, of course. But that was just a coincidence. The girl in the picture just looks like me. The birthdays are the same. It happens because there are only 365 days in a year, and there are a lot more people. I'm sorry, but I'm not your ex-girlfriend. I'm not your ex-girlfriend. You wish I was. And that would mean she's alive. But she's not, I'm sorry. You see, it's all written here. She showed him her papers again. Paul pressed his lips together and nodded. Sarah was silent. She waited for it to be over. Paul shook his head and just walked out. On the way home, he stopped out at a local bar. He went there regularly. Every Saturday there was a warm atmosphere, good music, quality drinks. Sometimes local musicians performed there. They did pretty good covers of famous hits. Paul sat there for over an hour. He reflected on something he would probably never forget many. First love is never forgotten. But how? Rarely does it grow into something more. The bartender poured him a new shot of whiskey, and his soul was relieved. And Sarah made a bad impression on him. Only now did he realize that the man could not have changed that much. Minnie was simple, humankind. She would never wear tight suits or speak so carelessly to a man. She had a temper, but at the same time, there was no kinder person in the world than her. He realized he was bored. But there was nothing he could do. She was gone. He should have gone to her funeral. It would have been easier for him. He wouldn't be catching ghostly hopes now. At home, hugging his cat, Paul decided firmly for himself that he would forget everything that had happened as a bad dream. It was just a false hope that hurt his gut, but it's all behind him now. And it would be worth it to visit her grave. Morning came suddenly as if there had been no night. It was the effect of whiskey on an empty stomach from the morning. Fortunately, he didn't have to go to work. Paul spent the day looking for a hobby. He couldn't make up his mind to enroll in skydiving school or go boxing. He needed to make a change in his life, to put something in it that could fill the emptiness that had formed inside. If it hadn't been for the damn wedding, he would have lived his life the way he had before, meeting 2 Lucy evenings at a time. He had completely forgotten to call her. With all these events, Paul had lost his personal life. For the evening, he invited a girl home. Ross was supposed to come over a day later. They were 2 nurses from different wards. They did not communicate with each other. He told the girls right away that he would not enter into a serious relationship, but could only offer a movie and intimacy. But it was not easy to resist the handsome dentist. Partners periodically changed. Some began to insist on more and left without getting what they wanted. Others themselves found more reliable partners and broke off relations in order to build a family. The next morning, Paul woke up in the arms of a pretty swarthy girl. She was so petite, sweet, and unpredictable that Paul sometimes wondered how she was still single. Annabelle liked him, but his heart beat steady when she was around. "Good morning. Shall I make breakfast?" she asked, opening her eyes. "Good morning. No, I have cookies, bread and butter. I like to have an easy breakfast." They ate. She looked very much like she was wearing his stretchy t-shirt. It was very large for a girl. And during the meal and later when Paul drove her to work in his car, he looked at her and thought there was something wrong with her. He had been alone for a long time. And Nabel is a beautiful young girl. But as soon as he imagined that she would be around all the time, that she would wake up next to him like that every day, a red button inside him would light up. He wasn't ready for a serious relationship, or he just hadn't met the one he would be ready for. The workday finally helped him come to his senses. He decided he was going to sign up for boxing. Parachute, he had been interested in the sport for a long time, during the years when he was dating Minnie. They wanted to enroll in skydiving school together, but it didn't work out. It's not worth remembering everything over and over and over again. It was half an hour before the end of the work shift. "Next," I called out to Paul, hoping the hallway would be empty. However, he heard a knock on the boiler tile. Sarah, the new mayor's wife, came through his door. "Tooth problems? Come in," he smiled. For a split second, he actually thought she might have come to him because of a toothache. But then he thought it was unlikely that the wife of such a man would sit in line for a free doctor. "Good afternoon, Paul. You weren't easy to find. You didn't leave any information about yourself, and I can't ask my husband. You know what kind of man he is. Fortunately, my secretary wrote down your name." Sarah sat down on a patient chair. Paul saw her and knew that everything was turning upside down inside him again. His old mental wound had just crusted over and was about to heal, but she was revealing her with her appearance. Just now, he infected her with alcohol at the bar. Lucy helped him. "I couldn't help thinking about everything you said. I was at my mother's house yesterday. I thought you should know that." Paul frowned. Now Sarah seemed nervous and confused to him. Where had all that pathos gone? "What should I know?" The handsome tall brunette in the white coat asked softly. "You know, I'm scared to death of doctors at the sight of your chair makes me want to faint. Let's talk in the cafe." Paul nodded and began to dress. There were no more patients in the hallway. They moved to an establishment near the hospital. Sarah ordered herself a mint tea. Paul could hardly contain himself from asking for whiskey. He had to make do with a cup of coffee. "If you don't start talking, I'll die of curiosity," Paul said quite seriously. The girl across from him smiled. Today she had a simple ponytail at the back of her head. The blonde hair was very much to her face. Her makeup was simple but neat. Minnie wore bangs, was brunette, and hardly any makeup. He kept comparing them in his head. "Sorry, I was at my mother's and asked her straight out about everything. I told her there was a girl who looked an awful lot like me, and I showed her the picture. You dropped it the day you were in my office." Sarah handed him a picture of him hugging Minnie. Minnie laughed. He remembered well the day the picture had been taken. They had had a terrible fight then, and then they had made up very passionately. "And what did your mother say?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the pictures. "She said she gave birth to 2. I had a twin sister, but she disappeared. It was a big deal. The whole town was buzzing. There was an accident at the maternity hospital at the time. After a heavy downpour, the roof collapsed in one of the rooms. No one was hurt, but all the mothers with children were transferred to the hospital. Mom had a difficult delivery, and the children were transported without her. She herself needed rest and treatment. Only when everyone was transported did the doctors realize that my little sister was missing. Then many people were suspected of her disappearance, police, residents, and staff. They checked everyone, but they couldn't find her. My mother thought the child had died as a result of the collapse. but they were silent about it in order not to institute criminal proceeding. After all, someone had to answer for such a thing. So she decided she just wasn't told, so she accepted it and tried never to bring it up. Paul listened to her and realized he was talking to his own sister, Minnie, now. Surprisingly, she always said she wished she had a sister. The girl's lips quivered and tears rolled down her cheeks. Now when I think I had a sister, I never recognized her. It makes me sick. Mom said she wanted to visit her grave. I could get the detectives involved, but Gorge wouldn't approve. I didn't tell him anything at all. He's been so sullen since the wedding. He's always suspicious of me. By the way, it's your fault he's jealous of you. Says I couldn't just find out about the mole. Maybe you should have told him you had a sister and that I wasn't crazy and hitting on you at the wedding, Paul asked ironically. There was a moment of anger in Sarah's eyes. You know, I don't have to tell you anything. It's just that you're accusing me of being an unbalanced tyrant, both at work, where that might be considered acceptable, and in the family. You married him. You should at least ask what happened to his 2 former wives. And Sarah jumped up from her seat, knowing that his exes were bugging us with their calls. They both wanted to go back to Gorge, despite his character. He's a real man, unlike many. Manliness is a rare quality these days. You men have all grown your beards, except that inside you are still fragile girls. I looked for a long time for a man who was stronger than me, and I found one, and not you. Oh, calm down, Paul interrupted her. You're as hot-tempered as your sister. She was too. You know, I liked that about her. And they say that twins are not alike in character. Sarah smiled. Tell me about her. They talked for a couple of hours. Then her tyrant husband called her and she had to leave. They arranged to meet in a day and visit Mother Minnie. Paul knew where she used to work and hoped to find her himself. Before meeting Sarah, Paul called the maternity hospital on the outskirts of town where Minnie Berta's mother used to work as a nurse. He asked to put her on the phone. When he heard her voice, he hung up. It wasn't easy for him. His heart pounded in his chest. It was pounding with excitement. It was as if he was picking apart an old wound inside him. Perhaps it would do him good to say goodbye to the past once and for all. After all, he had never said one last love to her, one last sorry. He chickened out and didn't go to the funeral. Maybe that didn't make him realize she was gone. To him, she was just gone. When he saw Sarah, he knew in his mind that it couldn't be Mapu, but hope lingered in his heart. And that was because for him their story ended with a dotted line. And there was a point to be made, to face my fear and say goodbye to the past. The weather was tearing the leaves to shreds, and it was pouring with rain, and the wind allowed it to go in all directions at once. There was no more bad weather this year. Paul finished his appointment and left the hospital. There she was already waiting for him. She was wearing a purple raincoat, heeled boots. Her hair was neatly gathered at the top of her head. "Couldn't you wear a hat in this cold?" he asked sarcastically. Many always wore silly, unfashionable, ridiculous hats, and they all suited her terribly. "I don't wear hats," she smiled. At that moment, a beautiful, dark-haired girl in a light jacket appeared behind her. She called out to Paul, and he turned around. "Lusu, hello," he said. The girl was clearly jealous. Sarah stood silent. "Busy today?" she asked quietly. "I have a thing, and I'll be free tonight. So if you want to," Lucy turned a disgruntled look from Paul to Sarah and back again. "No, not tonight, honey," she smiled charmingly, walked over to Paul, got on her toes, and kissed him on the lips. Then she looked him in the eye and left. "Without saying goodbye, you seem to have just been tagged," Sarah said. Once Lucy had gone far enough away, they got into his car and drove there to the very outskirts where the very maternity hospital was located. "I found out she still works Berta. The woman is kind. Don't scare her right away. Don't throw accusations at her. You know she probably stole the baby. She works as a nurse in a maternity hospital. I'm pretty sure she worked in the maternity hospital where I was born some time ago. She stole my sister, broke up the family, and separated the twins. Paul slammed on the brakes sharply. If that's the way you feel, I won't even take you there, he said, and folded his arms across his chest. The car stopped and stood in the middle of the roadway. Other road users honked their horns, detouring. I can find her without you. You understand, don't you? Of course I do. Tell your man the whole story. I don't think his ambition will play in your favor. Sarah herself didn't know why she was afraid to tell him. Maybe she was really afraid, or maybe she was really afraid, or maybe she was just looking for a meeting with Paul. He was the kind of man who was memorable to women. Let's go. I promise I won't eat her. She shook her lips grudgingly, and he noticed it. And the association set him back again, years too many. She was doing exactly the same thing. The car stopped outside the maternity hospital. Paul looked at his watch. Soon the shift would be over and she'd be out. We wait. The awkward silence was interrupted by Sarah. Was that girl? For some reason I thought you were single. She was. We're in a casual relationship with no strings attached. And believe me, she knows. It's just not all girls are cut out for this kind of thing. Relationships. And not all men are made for marriage. It was you, of course, who was being ironic now, Sarah. And what makes you think you're not cut out for marriage? Maybe you just married the wrong person. Marriage to the wrong person. Marriage to the wrong person can leave a negative imprint. I was actually talking about your husband. Sarah wanted to argue something and was already boiling over at his last words. Suddenly people started coming out of her. There she was. Let's go. Paul commanded. Without giving her a chance to snarl, they went on ahead of her. And soon the old woman saw before her a tall man of Paul's stature. The wind ruffled his hair before he could even catch Sarah keeping behind him. Hello, Berta, he said. He shivered inside. He'd been so afraid of this meeting. Paul, what are you doing here? She wondered. I came to see you. I wanted to talk about Manny. The woman was embarrassed. Well, she said with a shrug. Then her gaze fell upon his companion. She looked at Sarah and seemed about to faint. This is Sarah, my friend, said he. Everyone froze, afraid to say anything. Bert's was pale as a sheet. Berta walked over to the girl and touched her face. My God, Manny. My name is Sarah, said the girl. The woman lowered her eyes. She understood and cried. Berta, I reacted in the same way. At first I thought it was her. I wasn't at the funeral, and I so wanted to believe that she was alive. The woman was crying and looking at Sarah. Let's go somewhere and talk. Okay, she asked. And Berta cried even harder. Paul understood. Sarah's voice was exactly the same as Manny. 10 minutes later, they all entered the apartment where Manny used to live. From the walls, pictures of her with a black corner were staring at Sarah. It was creepy. She was beginning to shake from the inside out. Only on the outside she was icy stone, impenetrable. Sarah showed no weakness, but she was very vulnerable, and her nervous system had been crippled since childhood. Berta made tea. A dim light bulb burned in the kitchen. It hadn't been renovated since Paul came here to Manny. I took it from those people, from your parents. I remember when your mother came to the maternity ward in tears. Your daddy was a tyrant. He beat her. Even when she was pregnant, she had abrasions, bruises on her arms and legs. She cried that she wanted to leave him, but now she definitely won't. She gave birth, and the doctor told her she couldn't have any more children. She had some kind of congenital pathology, and pregnancy, especially multiple pregnancies, was already a risk. She told us nurses that he insisted on having a baby. He wanted an heir son. When he found out there were going to be 2 daughters and stopped talking to her, she had already given birth, and he came to visit. I heard them talking. Your mother told him she couldn't have any more babies, and he started accusing him that she wasn't a woman, that he didn't need her with 2 girls. He promised to kick her out of the house. It was a real scandal. Your mother cried so much that she had to be moved back to the emergency room. The doctors wouldn't let your father in the hospital. Paul listened to this and couldn't believe it. You didn't tell me you had such a father, he said. So what? Sarah shrugged. So you have chosen your husband to be like that. That's wonderful. You know, Berta, she has exactly the same husband. A tyrant and a German beats women. So much for psychology. Paul went off the subject and switched to Sarah's personality. She was embarrassed. Maybe you can give me a moral later. You're a lover of free relationships, Sarah quipped. Berta sighed and continued the story. There were 3 mugs of hot tea on the table. No one was going to take it. Everyone was too tense. I picked it up when I heard your mother's words. She said she wanted to give one of the girls up for adoption. That's how I don't know if she would have decided to do it or not. But she was asking the doctor how to do it, and then the collapse happened. I grabbed the baby girl and left with her through the garden. It was dark. No one saw me. There were no cameras back then. I took the little girl home to my mother and told her everything. I couldn't have children, and she was there for me. Then your father got lazy and started looking for a baby, and I knew I had to leave. My mom sold her apartment, and we were able to buy this one and pay a huge amount of money to have her put on the papers, as if she was born to me. It all worked out. And I was sure that I had saved the little girl from a life with a horrible person. Or from the orphanage. I would have taken you too, but I was afraid. Paul looked at Sarah. He expected her to start screaming about morality now, but she was crying. She still lives with him now. He's rich and can do anything, but you were the only one he could never trace. He beat my mother and me, and it was always like that. We were afraid of him. I didn't get straight A's because I wanted to, or because I was smart. I was afraid he would punish me. I spent my whole childhood kneeling on buckwheat. He's a terrible man. You're right, but not only did you steal a child from him, you robbed me of my sister and took a child from its mother. And now I don't even know how to feel about that. And Sarah said this through her tears and cried. Paul didn't expect this turn of events. He found himself in the company of 2 rows of gushing women and didn't know what to do. He would have liked to cry himself, but he knew that he would be ashamed in front of them. Berta and Sarah embraced and cried for a long time, and Paul sat next to him, dying of embarrassment, drinking his tea. He ended up clapping it too loudly, and it ruined the whole atmosphere. They looked at him, and he froze with the mug near his lips. I'm sorry. He let out an embarrassed laugh. Berta smiled, too, and wiped away her tears. Why didn't you come to bury her? She asked. I was scared. I didn't want to see her like that. If you'd come, it would have been different. You were the one who gave birth to her baby. I was sure I could have it for myself, but I couldn't. The local government wouldn't give him up. They told me the salary was small and I didn't own the apartment. It still belonged to my mom back then. I started registering it in my name. And when I reapplied, the child had already been adopted. You have a son. Many. I didn't want to tell you. She said you had another one. Paul took hold of his head, trying to comprehend everything he had just heard. How is that a child? Did I have a right to know where he was now? Why didn't you come to me when he was taken? He jumped to his feet and walked back and forth, and Sarah hugged Berta and told him to tone it down. The meeting took a turn for which no one was prepared. Paul began to ask Minnie's mother about the baby. It turned out that Minnie had been pregnant when they broke up. She didn't know at first, but when she found out, she saw him with another woman and decided she would keep the pregnancy a secret. She gave birth to the baby and then had an accident afterwards. The baby was also in the car. but he didn't have a scratch on him. The driver survived. Minnie covered the boy with herself and saved his life. She didn't even make it to the ambulance. Paul didn't know that, and the details eat away at his mind. Pale was a few weeks old. She took a cab to the children's clinic with him. They never gave him back to me. Child welfare took him away. I think it's karma. I stole someone else's baby, and now they stole mine. They took mine away. Maybe some childless rich guy paid to take my Paul. Did she call him what she called me? Paul had tears in his eyes. Berta nodded. They sat and drank tea for a long time. Then the phone rang and she hurried away. Now they learned that they had a relative in common. He must have been 9 years old. His name was Paul, and he was a nephew and his son. What are you going to do? He asked her as he stopped his car near the business center. That's where she had already parked in the morning. I don't know. I have to find the baby. But we can't do it without his help. Let's go to her grave tomorrow. I'll see what I can do. I'll see what I can do. I'll see what I can do. Okay, Paul looked at her. She was as anxious as he was. He felt like hugging her out of some old habit. That's what he had always done before when he saw the troubled expression on Minnie's face. She, too, lingered a little longer and looked at him in some peculiar way. In the evening, he was uneasy. He's a father. Who would have thought? He desperately wanted to run to his son, waving his arms and legs. But he had to wait out the day. Paul went to work in the morning, and there, during breaks, he called the local child welfare agencies and tried to find out information about his son, as often happens. One agency referred to another. No one knew anything, had any information, or was going to help him. By evening, exhausted, he met up with Sarah, and they drove to the local cemetery. Slamming along the damp path, they held hands. It was scary and exciting when Paul saw her grave. His legs weren't holding him. So I checked myself into the cemetery. Sarah blurted out and pressed her hand to her lips. Her exact replica, only with dark hair, was looking down at her from the slab. They stood there for a long time, each of them talking to many in their own minds. Before they knew it, they began to embrace each other. Paul, he held her close to him, and Sarah clung to his hand. It was cold, wet, and they were both crying. Pale thought that he hadn't lived through it when she was buried, and he had to relive it now. There's no escaping the truth anyway. It's not there. Let's all go, she said, placing 2 red roses on the ground. They walked back through the cemetery, wiping the tears from their faces. They arrived at a cafe in the middle of nowhere and decided to warm up and have coffee. It was dark inside. It was dark inside. It was noisy and happy. They sat there not smiling, each reliving their grief. I never would have thought it would be like this. Neither would I if someone had told me I would sit and talk to my twin sister like this. Having just visited her grave, I wouldn't have believed it. Life isn't just unpredictable. It just seems to mock. Aaron nodded. We have to go back home, she said. Will you tell him? There was a pause. I don't know. They walked out of the cafe. Paul didn't know what came over him. He took Sarah's hand and asked the question that had been haunting him for a long time. Why are you with him? Are you out of your mind? Your father killed your mother and you found one for yourself. Why? God? She was confused. She shrugged her shoulders. I don't know. I guess all girls look for suitors who look like their fathers. Are you afraid to tell him that you have a twin sister with a nephew here? Is that life? Do you really need that adrenaline? You want the fear. You want to get beaten up. Paul was getting loose. He held her hands and almost shouted, and tears spurted from her eyes. I don't know. Get off me. Sarah pushed him away. Without expecting it, he wrapped his arms around her and held her so tightly that she wouldn't break free. He didn't understand why he did it. She didn't understand why she didn't want him to let her go. She agreed, in his arms, and calmed down. He let her go and looked into her eyes. She was without heels today and barely reached the top of her chin. You put your arms around me, but you see her in front of you, she said resentfully and walked away. Paul got in the car and grabbed his head. He realized that this was how they always fought with many. She was probably right. He saw many in front of him and his feelings rekindled. His subconscious refused to understand that this was another person. Paul arrived home in utter confusion. He fed the cat, petted it, and passed out in front of the TV under some kind of horror movie. During the night, he had nightmares. He woke up in a cold sweat, not really remembering what he had seen. Paul drank some tea, talked to the cat, and settled back down on the couch under the TV. This time he turned on a channel that showed a good old-fashioned comedy. This helped him sleep until morning. The day rewarded Paul with a headache and a dozen screaming patients. You're in pain now, but it will stop hurting. And I'm in pain now and will always be in pain. Because I saw Minnie's grave yesterday, and her sister seems to really like me. But is there anything between you? Is anything between us? Is anything possible? She's married after all. And she thinks I only see her as Minnie, which, if she's right, her thoughts were endless. Spit. Paul spat mechanically and went back to himself. Usually he talked to patients, distracted them, but today he himself would not be distracted by someone who could distract him. The problem was also that he didn't know if Sarah would call him. Maybe he had hurt her feelings yesterday, but she called, making an appointment at the same cafe. Paul came and saw her at a table. He sat down across from her and looked at her guiltily. I'm sorry, he said. It's okay. She shrugged her shoulders. He no longer saw that cold businesswoman in front of him. She had become human with him, simple and kind. He realized that her coldness was only a mask. She was very different on the inside. Exactly right. I found my nephew, you know. Hired a detective myself behind my husband's back. That's his man. But I asked him not to say anything to Gorge. He found Paul for hours. He's still at the orphanage. They haven't given him away. Grief-stricken techs without a place of their own. That was the only reason. Then he was transferred to another shelter. Some paperwork got lost. As was told, he wasn't in the database and was probably sheltered. At the same time, Paul had a note that he had relatives and they could take him. Children like this are reluctant to be placed for adoption. Foster parents want to be sure that no one will come and take their children away from them. So we can take him. Only which one of us is going to take him? Paul smiled. That's terrific news. Let's go there right now. I'll make arrangements and they'll let us in. I'll take him. You can't. Your husband is a tyrant. Sarah shrugged her shoulders. But we have more money, and he's a rich man, and I can't have children. It's not working out for us. We haven't been for a long time. I guess it's just me. Gorge was tested, and he said there's nothing wrong with him. What if we adopted him and you came to visit? Paul took her hand. It's my son. Sarah, what are you doing? I'm not giving him up to anyone. You'll come visit and your husband won't even know about any of this. You don't have to tell him if you're afraid. I don't know what you're afraid of, though. Suddenly, Gorge came through the door of the cafe. He saw them holding hands and headed toward them. Gorge, Sarah stood up from her seat. You thought David wouldn't tell me. I found out everything about your meetings, too. But you're trash, he said, and slapped Sarah across the face with a full swing. Paul jumped up and punched Gorge. A fight ensued in response. Sarah screamed, begging him to stop, but Gorge was not himself. He punched and threw Paul around the cafe and then continued outside. The waiters tried to stop him, but jealousy made eyes. Gorge only stopped when a police officer from the street ran up to him. He came to his senses, slipping money to the waiter to make amends. Sarah sat beside Paul, trying to bring him to his senses. What have you done? cried Sarah. What? Do you love him? You're fiancés of the sister he left with the baby. And now you're going behind my back with him every day. I found out everything. It's not like that. She was crying. One of the visitors called an ambulance. Sarah and Paul were taken away. Are you going to file a police report? Asked the woman doctor. No, he's a very powerful man. There is no point in that. Paul opened his eyes the next day. Sarah was sitting in the room. He smiled and realized that it hurt to smile. Hello? I was beginning to think I was going to have to visit another grave. You have a sense of humor, she gave out. He wanted to get up. Sarah laid him back down. Lay down. You have a concussion. You've been out for a long time. This is your hospital. I had the doctors take you here. What did I miss? He asked. Sarah shrugged. Last night, my father called me. Someone made a video of Gorge beating me and then you. He said he wouldn't just leave it at that. Gorge ended up going to jail this morning. Yes, he's very powerful, but so is my father. He works with the top politicians, and he can do something else. He's a tyrant, of course, and a very intemperate man, but he loves me. My mother told him everything, and he's coming today, so I'm going to pick him up at the airport soon. I think we'll come and see you again. She wanted to get up and leave. She looked at her watch and realized she was running late. Today her blonde hair was loose and her makeup was covering up a bruise that wasn't swathed in any total cream. I'm not giving you the baby. I am his father. I have first right of adoption, and I have a good job and a big apartment. Paul is my son and will live with me. Said he. Seriously? Sarah sighed. I would never take him away from you yesterday. I just suggested it. I didn't know how you felt about it. I had no intention of depriving you of your son. She was about to leave when he called out to her again. Are you with him? Yes. I think I am. Sarah left and Paul was alone in the room. During the day, almost everyone he knew came to see him. Lucy was the last one to stop by. She kissed him, stroked his hair, and asked. It was Sarah. I think I'm in love with her, he said. It was a revelation Paul had not expected of himself. Lucy shrugged. I knew it that night. I wish you good luck with her sincerely, but if you get lonely, call me. She smiled at him slyly, winked and left. Such a breakup was perfect. No tears, no tantrums. Paul once again thought that Lucy was gold and he was not worthy of her. But the reason was different. He really liked Sarah. He missed her, though. She had been here quite recently. She came in the next morning. Along with her father entered the room. He was in a suit, serious full, but hunchbacked, and dark eyes that looked right into her soul. After meeting him for the first time, Sarah's father said he was willing to help with the adoption, and Paul agreed. It's no good if the kid has to wait until he's discharged from the hospital and has a whole bunch of paperwork to gather. Consider my man already handling the matter, he said. Thank you. Thank you for managing to get through to Sarah. If it hadn't been for your chance encounter, we never would have known the fate of the other daughter. I had a temper at the time, made a lot of trouble. But when my child was stolen, I was not myself. We went to her grave yesterday. You know, I'm not going to touch that woman. God is her judge. What's done is done. But I'd like to know how many lived. What was she like? You should come and see us. And of course, I will see my grandson. Of course, no problem, replied Paul. When Sarah's father left the room, it was just the two of them. Paul took her hand. He didn't say anything to her, he just held her hand and looked into her eyes. Do you look at me now and see her? She asked bitterly. You're wrong. I look at you and I see how different you are. You're deeper, you have more devils in you. More what you want to know. Sarah smiled. There's a lot of painkiller in you. I want to be with you. Don't go away. Your father said you would leave in the morning. I can't go without you. She looked at him. He sounded serious. I want to be away from Gorge. He was released today and removed from his position. You know, he asked me to stay. So now we don't have a mayor again. It's like a curse. I need to leave. You need to stay. We'll take him together and raise him genetically. You're the spitting image of his mother. I don't think I dare suggest that to anyone else. I've been a bachelor for a long time, a very long time, but I'm willing to change all that for you. Sarah leaned over and kissed him on the forehead. I will think about what you said, she said. The next day she flew away with her father. Paul called her every day and begged her to come back, and she arrived on the day he was supposed to, was to take his son home. The boy turned out to be an exact copy of Manny, and consequently of Sarah. The two of them brought him home and told him the whole story from beginning to end. And why don't you want to live with Paul? Asked the grown-up, sensible young man. There's a soup prepared by Sarah on the stove. He felt uncomfortable calling him father. It would take some getting used to. I'm not divorced yet. And your dad likes to live alone. He's a loner and I'll only get in his way. And that's not true. I want you to stay and get in my way and piss me off for the rest of my life. He intervened from the bedroom, preparing a room for Paul Jr. Sarah, if you're an exact replica of my mother, I'd like to see you all the time, every day. I think that's what Mom would have wanted too. To this, Sarah had nothing to say. She hugged her nephew for the umpteenth and 100th time that day, and he said she could strangle him, but only if she agreed to stay. It was a victory. Sarah called her father and told him she wanted to stay here with her nephew. Soon Sarah's parents came to visit, and Berta visited him almost every day. It was very strange when they all gathered around the communal table. Sarah's mother and the one who had stolen her child. However, after a heart-to-heart talk, they managed to understand each other. Now their lives revolved around the 9-year-old Paul, who was a bully. He studied poorly, but only because he was lazy. He wanted to play sports. Paul sent him to boxing. He was going to sign up himself. But now he had enough to worry about from the idea. Skydiving had to be abandoned. When you're a single parent, risking your life over nonsense is just not right. Everyone parted ways, and Sarah saw her parents off and told them she'd probably stay here. Here was her job at the business center and her nephew who needed her. Also here was Paul, his sister's one and only love. There was obviously something special about him because Sarah had fallen in love with him herself. Only she was afraid that he would see her as a different person all his life. When a month passed after filing for divorce, Sarah and Gorge met to sign the papers. Sarah agreed to sign the papers. Sarah agreed to sign waivers for any material claims. You know, I'm kind of glad it worked out that way. You're not right for me, he told her. Sarah shrugged her shoulders. I didn't know you were so unstable. You drove me to it. You got me into a fight and made me lose my job. I'll have to start all over again. Besides, you're a childless bimbo. I don't know how I ever married you. Both my mistresses were against me from the beginning. Sarah grinned. You change wives and mistresses are constant. There are women who don't need a ring on their finger to be with me. There are men who don't pick up his hand on the woman. Farewell. Sarah turned and walked away, giving him one last cold look. She walked out the door, and Gorge broke the handle she had just signed the divorce papers. Paul and Sarah were soon married. They had a real family. Paul Jr. got his father's last name and his middle name. He originally had other details. Many gave him the name Paul, but decided to keep his last name and patronymic. Apparently, she was angry with Paul for not having him around. Sarah, on the other hand, became pregnant soon after the wedding. She had a beautiful baby girl. Sarah's parents asked that she be named Mary. That's the name. They wanted to give it to her sister before she was stolen. Alberta hinted that it would be good to name their daughter Manny. But Sarah gave her a completely different name, Radha. I want her to be a winner. Let her have a strong character and destiny. not like me or my sister. Paul smiled and hugged his wife. What's wrong with your destiny? Aren't you happy? I am happy. But I've lived my whole life without knowing my sister. Besides, I was used to living near a tyrant. After my overbearing father, I found a husband like him, and he almost killed you. You know, I didn't tell you, but I was so frightened for you that day that my hands were shaking. I wasn't thinking straight. I almost fainted. I thought he'd killed you. And then I felt you breathing. That's when I finally admitted to myself that I was in love with you. Paul hugged her even tighter and kissed her. You are the most amazing woman in the whole world. I think all my life decisions have led me to you. I guess we were meant to be together from the beginning. They stood looking at little Rada, and next to them stood Paul, smiling happily.